John was with us last year, and as Marcus put it, he's author, academic and political activist, and of course he's of the Leveller Association, and he's going to speak about his wonderful book, his new book, The Leveller Revolution, and I'm very much looking forward to that. The Leveller Revolution and the role and importance of the Levellers during the English Civil Wars. So without further ado, John, if you'd like to step up to the podium and we'll hear your lovely talk.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation to come down and speak again. Now, I guess the place to start really is this, that in the 1640s, the English people did something absolutely historically unique. At the end of 2 civil wars, they put their king on trial, and they found him guilty of treason against the people and executed him on a platform built outside the banqueting house in London's Whitehall, exactly where it still is. And on that day, in January 1649, there were, among others, 2 people on that platform where Charles I was executed. One of them was a man called Richard Rumbold, and another was a man called John Harris. And they were both members of an organisation called the Levellers. They had, in many ways, every right to be there, because they and their compatriots had been at the forefront of every phase of the English Revolution since it broke out, and in some cases we'll see before it broke out, and they put, perhaps at every phase of the revolution, some of the most radical and far-reaching arguments which still echo in terms of the history of democratic ideas in this country to this day. It was Richard Rumbold who, when he was much later executed in Edinburgh, said on his own scaffold that no man comes into the world with a saddle on his back, and no man booted and spurred to ride him. And he got that phrase from the man that he was stood with on the scaffold, John Harris, who had first used it in a Leveller paper called Mercurius Militaris, or the Army Scout, which was directed at the soldiers of the New Model Army in the critical phase of the English Revolution after and during the second Civil War. But the origins of the Levellers, which I want to talk about first, lie much further back, and in a way they lie with the most famous Leveller of all, John Lilburne, or Freeborn John, as he was known to the London crowd, and this is how he got that name. He was in the business, as many religious radicals were, of importing illegal religious literature from Holland into England in the late 1630s. Now, of course, at this stage, the English Church played a unimaginably larger role in society than it does today. In many ways, it's performed the functions that in modern society are not just performed by the Church, but by the civil service, by the courts in part, by the mass media. It was compulsory that you were a member of the English Church, and not just any part of it, but your local parish church, and if you didn't attend, you could be fined and ultimately imprisoned. And those Puritans, and among them the very many of the Levellers, who didn't want to be part of that church, who had a kind of extreme version of the idea that the church needed to be reformed to the point of not being a coercive national body, and that simply worshippers should pursue their own much more individual relationship with God through gathered or independent churches. Some sort of non-separatist Congregationalists wanted to remain formally part of the Church of England, and many, like John Lilburne and others in the Levellers, wanted to be separate from the Church of England. And those dissenters were engaging in illegal activity, and the pamphlets they were circulating and reading were illegal productions, and that's why they were being produced in the Netherlands and smuggled into England. John Lilburne was arrested for doing this by members of the Stationers' Company, which had a legal monopoly of printing, and he was dragged before the Court of Star Chamber, a royal prerogative court, in which probably the most common form of conviction was gained by extracting, by one means or another, an admission of guilt from the defendant with no jury. And Lilburne protested, famously protested, that it was the right of every freeborn Englishman not to be examined against himself and to be tried by a jury of his peers. And this is the point at which he becomes known as Freeborn John Lilburne. For his defiance, he was jailed in the Fleet Prison, where the eastern end of Fleet Street now is. He was taken out, tied to the back of a horse and cart, and whipped every step of the way from the Fleet Prison to Westminster Old Palace Yard with a three-thonged knotted leather whip. One witness said that his shoulders had swollen to the size of penny loaves. He was put in the stocks, where he continued to throw the illegal pamphlets from his coat pocket and to make speeches until he was gagged by his jailer. Once he was then returned to prison amidst much protest from the crowds around him, women coming forward and dipping their scarves in the blood that had come from his back, from his wounds. And even while in prison, he managed to smuggle out leaflets which encouraged, and some say, certainly his enemies said, caused a riot among the London apprentices. He was eventually only freed by the meeting of the Long Parliament, and the MP who used his first speech in the Long Parliament to urge Lilburne's freedom was a little-known MP from Huntingdon called Oliver Cromwell. Now, when he was freed, the presses that he'd already been associated with began to turn and produced an account of his imprisonment called The Christian Man's Trial, printed by a man called William Larner, who was a long-standing associate of Lilburne's and would remain an absolutely central printer for the Leveller cause right the way through until after the Revolution, and still in the mid-1650s was printing the pamphlets of Gerard Winstanley, the digger leader. He was also being printed by a man called Richard Overton in a secret press that was being run by Overton in Coleman Street near the Guildhall in London. And I guess this part, the very origins of the Levellers, tells you a lot about what they did, how they organised, and why they were influential, because it brings together these critical aspects: dissenting underground religion, illegal printing, and the ability to distribute illegal petitions and pamphlets to a very wide audience. Not at this stage, but later on we have Lilburne claiming, at least, that there were 30,000 copies of a single petition coming off the presses. Now that's for a total, if you think about that, would be a decent print run of a petition today in England with a population of 60 or 70 million. We're talking about a country whose total population was 5 million in the 1640s. That would have been a huge print run, and a lot of it would have been directed in London with a population of perhaps 350,000. So you've got here an organisation which, at every turn of the revolution, addresses new constituencies. It addresses the apprentices and the religious radicals in the gathered churches in the early and mid 1640s. It addresses the rank and file of the New Model Army when it's formed, and when many Levellers, Lilburne included, Larner included, go to war as part of the parliamentarian forces. Louvain is famously captured at the Battle of Brentford, taken to Oxford, jailed by the king, put on trial for his life in Oxford. Only escapes because, again, smuggles pamphlets which are then printed. They're in the heart. This is in the middle of war. They're in the heart of the enemy capital. He's in prison, in Oxford prison, and he still manages to get material out which are printed on the London presses. He appeals in one of the smuggled pamphlets for Parliament to act on his behalf. Parliament, very late in the day, says, if you execute John Lilburne, we will execute the royalist prisoners that we are holding. This message only gets to Oxford because Elizabeth Lilburne, a very formidable activist in her own right, Lilburne's wife, rides through enemy and allied checkpoints all the way to Oxford to deliver the message, and Lilburne is eventually freed and returns to London. So I hope that what I'm giving you is a picture of people who are beginning to coalesce and organise around the business of radical religion and illegal printing, and are beginning to do it on a politically effective scale. For the first part of the whole revolutionary process and through the First Civil War, they're allied to the main parliamentarian leadership of the independence of Oliver Cromwell and so forth and so on. As that war ends and the debates begin about what kind of settlement is going to be made in England after the war, what is going to be done with the king, what will be the constitutional settlement, what will be the religious settlement, will the old Church of England simply be replaced by a new Presbyterian church with, as far as the radicals were concerned, many of the same faults of hierarchy and coercive powers that the old church had, as John Milton famously put it, the new presbyter is just the old priest writ large, or was there going to be the freedom of religion that they'd been persecuted for practicing before the revolution took place? And those debates after the first Civil War are right across the society, and crucially happening in the new model army that had won the war. The conservative or moderate parliamentarians and their Scottish allies seek to deal with this radical debate by closing down the place where it is most advanced in the new model army. And they seek to disband the regiments of the new model army or send them to Ireland to get rid of the political challenge to the settlement that they want to have with the king. A new constituency opens up before the Levellers at this point because the army revolts. It simply refuses to disband. In an absolute historical first, it elects agitators, first in the cavalry, then in the infantry, elected representatives who then debate with the highest commanders of the new model army, with Thomas Fairfax, with Oliver Cromwell, with his son-in-law, Commissary General Henry Ireton, what the future settlement of the nation is going to be. They seize the king. I mean, I guess one of the most emblematic moments of the whole of the English Revolution is where somebody who was in many ways associated with the radicals, later called a leveller, although I don't think he was, but Cornet George Joyce seizes the king from the parliamentary commissioners, from the Scottish commissioners, and this is the lowest ranking officer, Cornet's the lowest ranking officer in the army. And when asked by the king on whose authority he's acting, asked, what is your commission by Charles, he simply turns around eventually and points to the 500 mounted men behind him and say, this is my commission. And Charles, to be fair to him, says, it's a finer commission as I've ever seen written. So there's another radical shift in the revolution, and this expresses itself in the famous Putney debates, where the Levellers bring forward a document, the Agreement of the People, which calls for freedom of religion, which calls for the freedom to publish, and which argues for a very considerable, at least, extension of the male franchise. They're defeated at a mutiny shortly after in the army, shortly after the Putney debates at Courtbush Field in Ware, but they rebuild themselves after this and are crucial in 1648 as allies. Cromwell and Ireton, who refused all their demands at Putney, who executed one of their members on the field of the mutiny at Ware, become aware in 1648 that if they aren't very, very careful, there will be what a petition from Ireton's regiment called the re-enthroning of the king. That the Conservatives will come to a personal treaty with the king, and as one of the debaters, I think Edward Sexby says in the Putney debates, the king will return and decide which of our throats to cut first. And at this point, there is a reassembling of a political bloc between Oliver Cromwell and his supporters and the Levellers, famously consolidated the day after one of the Leveller leaders' funeral. Thomas Rainsborough, one of the main spokesmen at Putney, killed in a royalist raiding party in Doncaster during the siege of Pontefract Castle. Huge Leveller demonstration attends his funeral. The day after, at the Nag's Head Inn in London, Henry Ireton sits down with the leaders of the Levellers and with the one MP that supported the Levellers, Henry Martin, and they essentially conclude a pact to push through by a process of mass petitioning the final phase of the revolution, which leads to the exclusion of the moderate MPs in Pride's Purge from Parliament, and the whole process of setting up the court, which tries and then executes Charles I. So my conclusion is this, really, that these weren't the most numerous people in the English Revolution. They weren't the people that had the greatest social weight in the Revolution compared to people like Cromwell and Fairfax. But they were the people who, at a critical juncture, provided a radical impulse and a popular mobilisation and an ability to shape the debate which changed the course, helped change the course of the English Revolution, and make it, in the end of the day, a revolution which executed the king. I mean, you have to remember what a kind of seismic shock to the society this would have been. Previously, it was only thinkable that a subject could behave treasonably towards a monarch. It was inconceivable that a monarch could behave treasonably towards the people. And in the end of the day, they established, and the Levellers were central to this, the idea that that was possible. That in the Latin tag of the time, Salus Populi Supremus Lex. The safety of the people is the highest law. And Thomas Rainsborough's brother William Rainsborough, his battle flag, had the disembodied head and axe of Charles I with that tag written around it. And it was on that principle that someone who had caused the bloody disaster of 2 civil wars was not fit to rule, and that the safety of the people demanded that he be deposed and another system of government put in its place. The Levellers wanted that to be at least a more democratic republic. Cromwell and his supporters were happy for it to be a military republic. And once they had established power, they turned on the allies that they had concluded the pact with to make that revolution happen, and crushed them. But what we should take from that is that this was the first time that a document, any kind of document, democratic principles embodied in it, was proposed for a constitution of this country, and that these people turned to their fellow citizens and by methods of political conviction and mass mobilisation made a difference to the whole course of the revolution in the late 1640s.